Good morning. Once again, welcome to Knightswood Congregational Church Online. I'm really keeping my fingers crossed that we are soon to be open. I don't know because obviously we've got to wait and see where we're at, but I'm actually still on holiday. Hi. I'm really sunning it up in the Bahamas just now, as you would probably think, and some of you probably will. Anyway, we're starting to get into the autumn. We're in August the 9th. Where has the year gone since lockdown? And it won't be long till we're looking at the leaves coming off the trees and the storms that usually come with autumn and winter. One of the things I quite enjoy about living in Britain is the fact that the British Met Office and the Met Iran in Ireland have now came into an agreement to name any new storms which hit the British Isles, and they give them names by certain letters in the alphabet like Hurricane, Aoife, Brenda, Derek, and so on. And over my course of my life, we've had many storms on the whole hitting these British Isles, and usually the debris left over from a hurricane that's hit the American seaboard on the east side of America. So I think it's fair to say that many of us Scots know a wee bit about storms and high winds, and we've come through them relatively unscathed. Oh, we might have gained a wheelie bin or lost one. We might have gained a trampoline or two. Usually I lose the felt covering off my shed, but hey ho, but apart from that, we come through it generally unscathed. So it brings me to the story about the fishermen today in Matthew's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Several of those disciples were by profession, by trade, they were fishermen. And they had spent much of their lives out in the sea, so they knew how to read the sea. And they had obviously, no doubt, they had seen many storms. And they knew that such squalls could come out and could come up quickly without much warning. As any of us who have ever ventured out in Scotland on a day out have often found we went out with Jacob on, only to realise that we weren't dressed appropriately for the weather. But all that experience that the disciples had and all that knowledge did not keep them from being afraid as the wind howled and the waves crashed against their boat. If you've ever been on a boat in a force 10 gale, it's not fun, let me tell you. We've got one sailor in our congregation and he seems to enjoy it, whereas I'm usually got my head over the boat throwing up, but that's a different story. Fear is the overwhelming emotion that the disciples exhibit in this story. They're afraid of the storm. They are so afraid. And they're afraid of Jesus walking on water. And Peter is afraid of them going out on the water in the first place. And even when the storm is over and they're all safely in the boat, there is still a sense of fear at the awesome power that Jesus displays as the Son of God. And the fear is something that we can probably relate to. And it's not just because we have had some stormy weather around here recently, and I don't mean with the weather as such. At this present moment, we're living in a society that's fearful. We're afraid of crime, and so we build prisons or we put more people in prison than ever before. We're afraid of foreign powers, so we build huge arsenals of weapons. You only have to travel down to Faslane at the Clyde and we've got the nuclear deterrent. So we spend billions of pounds each year on weapons. And we're afraid of economic ruin even more so at this time. So we hoard money away, vast sums of wealth. Maybe not you and I in particular, certainly not me. And it's funny, but in an election year, if you've ever watched it, that's what the politicians always play on. Because we'll hear words like safety and security, And I would imagine the party conferences, whenever they take place, and before our next general election, whether it be the Scottish parliamentary election in 2021 or the UK-wide general election, I think we'll hear the words of safety used quite a lot, and security, and it will be more kind of economic security that they'll be talking about rather than personal security. And yes, we often feel like those disciples in that boat. We often feel as if there are much larger forces crashing and swirling around and driving us beyond our control. And that certainly is true at this time. And all of us feel we're able to do much more than to sit fearfully in life rafts, hanging on for our life. But the disciples are sitting in this position. And then an amazing thing happens. They've been out in this boat all night. They've been battling the wind, the rain, and the waves. Then, in the hours just before dawn, when things seem to be at their darkest, Jesus shows up. And he comes walking across the waves and through the howling winds, right through, cutting through like a hot butter, a hot knife going through frozen cold butter. And now the disciples' fear is at its peak, because they're not going to be sure if they're going to make it back to land without the boat breaking apart. But Jesus arrives to rescue them. But instead of alleviating their fears, Jesus' arrival simply adds to their fears. Really, it's like putting the cat amongst the pigeons. After all, they have never seen anyone before walk on the surface of water. And so they think they're seeing a ghost. And perhaps they think this is some sort of bad omen, because fishermen are very superstitious. And it's a sign for them that are about to die. So Jesus has to tell his disciples, hey, it's me, have courage. Do not be afraid. Now these words, do not be afraid, or in the King James Version of the Bible, fear not, are very common in the Gospels. It seems that whenever there is an encounter between a divine being and a human being, the human reaction is one of fear. The angel that came to Mary announcing Jesus' birth began by saying, do not be afraid, or fear not. And the same words were spoken by the angels to the shepherds in Luke's Gospel, chapter 2, verse 10, and those whom the woman discovered in the empty tomb in Matthew's Gospel 28, verse 5. And Jesus himself had to tell his disciples not to be afraid as he appeared to them following his resurrection. And in each of these cases, there is a divine messenger bearing good news, a news of salvation. But the reaction of those who receive the news is inevitably one of absolute fear. It is ironic that we humans live lives filled with fear, and I see that more so just now because of people being so fearful of catching this COVID-19. But when there is divine intervention intended to alleviate that fear, it seems that we only become even more fearful. As bad as things may be, we kind of get used to them. We might be afraid of strangers. We might be afraid of our neighbours. We might be afraid of the future. We have learned to live with fear most of our lives in one way or the other. But what we've not learned to live with is the fact that God teaches us that whenever and whatever the circumstances we may find ourselves in, When we find ourselves face to face with a divine presence, we seem to be more afraid than ever. And that's how the disciples are feeling. They're in the middle of this lake. They're tossed about by the stormy seas. And when Jesus suddenly appears in the midst of this tempest, and they are unable to escape this divine presence, Peter, as he often seems to do, does something a bit rash. He says to Jesus, "If you are really Jesus, then let me walk across the water to you." And of course, Jesus says, "Bring on you come." And then Peter steps out in the boat. Now remember, there's still a storm raging, the wind is still roaring, the lightning is still flashing, the rain is still pouring, the sea is still churning, and here's Peter stepping out of the boat. And the rest of the disciples surely must have thought that he's lost his mind. But at that moment, Peter becomes a model for courage. The rest of the disciples, meantime, are still back in the boat. They're still absolutely filled with fear. They certainly don't like where they are, what they're doing. It isn't a safe place for them to be. They prefer to be heading out of that water back to dry land. They're not willing to trade to the uncertainty of danger, to the uncertainty of something else that might be even more dangerous. But Peter, he steps out. Give him his due. He steps out into the unknown because Jesus calls him to. And there's a particularly important lesson for each of us to understand. We too would like to stay huddled in our places of relative safety. We too are fearful of what might happen to us if we go beyond what we know our comfort zones are. If we step out of the relatively safe little harbours, little zones that we've created around ourselves. We may not exactly like where we are, but it still seems better than the alternative. And we call this common sense. And no doubt the story is not about taking stupid chances for the mere sake of adventure, but the story illustrates for us there are times when Christ comes to us in the midst of our tempests and of our tribulations. And there are times that Christ calls us to take risks, to step out of the boat just as Peter did, to act decisively on the faith that we claim to have. And when that happens, we must be ready to recognize that God's presence is there in the midst of the storm. And we must be ready to respond to the call of Christ regardless of the risk. We must be ready to put aside our fear and live by faith. And this is what Peter does, at least for one brief shining moment. But then the fear returns. Peter looks out at the wind raging about him. He looks down at the waves swelling under his feet, and he probably realizes now exactly what he's done. And very understandably, he immediately becomes afraid. That fear leaves him vulnerable once again, vulnerable to the storm, and it draws him down deep into the water. And what seemed at the time like the right thing to do a moment earlier suddenly seems, instead of a colossally stupid thing to do, and so Peter begins to sink. And as Peter sinks into the lake, he cries in terror and in desperation, "Lord, save me!" And Jesus stretches out his hand. He grabs Peter and he lifts him into the boat, whereupon the storm ceases, the wind grows still, the rain falls no more, the water calms, and the danger has now passed. And in one sense, Peter has failed. He has taken the first few courageous steps, but then the old fears have overtaken him. And what begins as an act of courage and bravery ends for Peter in terror and embarrassment. But still, Jesus acts to save him. I would argue that each and every person that I know is a lot like Peter. And there is a time that we muster up the courage to step out of our usual surroundings and comfort zones. And we take a few steps and then panic when things don't seem to go right. Things don't seem to go the way we hope or planned. But the good news is that God is there to rescue us when we fall. If we have been faithful to God's call, God will see it that we're taken care of. Of that I have no doubt. And that doesn't mean that we'll necessarily be successful in all we do. Peter himself couldn't complete the task of walking in water that he began out to do. So if we're taking risks, even if they are risks that God has called us to take, it's almost inevitable that at times we too will flounder, we will fall, we will fail. We are, after all, still human. But God is with us in our failures. God may be disappointed with us, just as we so often disappoint ourselves. But God will still love and care for us regardless of whether we sink or swim in our efforts, as long as we learn from our mistakes, as long as we are faithful to God's call in taking risks. Then there is nothing shameful or wrong about failure. Yes, at this time, more than ever, we live with many fears. We're afraid of being victims of crime and terrorism and of this virus. We're afraid of what might happen to us with our jobs, with our income, with our houses, with our family in the future. We are afraid of death. But we're also afraid of rejection. We're afraid of really being ourselves, because if people knew what we were like, then they wouldn't like us. But God knows. And God loves us. And God comes to us in the midst of our fears, wherever they may be. And our responsibility is to meet God halfway. Yes, to step out of that fearful existence in which we so often live, and to take risks of faith in response to God's call. And if and when we fail, and we will, we need to graciously accept the loving grace and forgiveness that God offers us. But rest assured, His arm will be outstretched to lift us up. Amen.